Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kobe Johnson from AFS 400, the Flight Technologies and Procedures Division here at FAA headquarters in Washington, D.C., where I can tell you it's a sultry 104 degrees in the shade today here at D.C. This is a interactive video training, or we prefer to call it information sharing program, that we're going to provide you today. It's the third in a series of such programs that Flight Standards has developed for our field inspector force in the last several months, and it's been, to our knowledge, very well received in the field. We anxiously ask that you continue giving us feedback, because they are expensive to produce, and we find it a very expeditious way to get information to the field on policy and issues like that. But today we're going to talk about Advisory Circular 120-91. It's the Airport Obstacle Analysis Advisory Circular. Some of you may have remembered it as the draft 120.obs, which has been around for many, many years. We're going to talk about that in a bit. Now, the intent of this presentation is not to make POIs or Flight Standards inspectors TERPS experts or aircraft performance engineers. The intent is to acquaint them with the methodologies and processes contained in the advisory circular the airlines actually have been using for many years. The subject has resulted in some confusion for Flight Standards inspectors, and this briefing hopefully will clarify that. I'm going to ask that you hold your questions till the end of the program, and then we'll be able to go through. The slides are numbered. If you have issues with any of the slides, please just jot that down, and we'll go back and address it at the end of the program. But first, let's look at the advisory circular's stated purpose. This AC principally does two things. First, the AC describes acceptable methods and guidelines for developing takeoff and initial climb-out airport obstacle analyses and in-flight procedures considering engine-out operations. Second, it describes the development of specific engine-out procedures, or EOPs. It's kind of a new term for some of us. It complies with the intent of the regulatory requirements of CFR Part 121, Part 135, and other associated one-engine inoperative, or OEI, airplane performance requirements relating to turbine engine-powered airplanes, and it prescribes two methods for the development of engine-out procedures, EOPs. This AC is really the only game in town that the airlines have been using for many years, and we're going to explain that in the future. But it does provide some very useful guidelines. It is derived from extensive FAA and industry experience. It's been used by the industry for over 13 years as a draft document. It was signed out by the AFS 1 office on May 5th of this year. It applies to operations conducted under Part 121 and operations of large transport and commuter category airplanes conducted under Part 135. Now, to understand the intent of the advisory circular, we need to examine a few regulations. Now, these regulations specify required takeoff and performance operating limitations for airplanes that experience an engine failure. They include how to determine that the takeoff flight path meets specified obstacle clearance requirements in the event of an engine failure also. CFR Part 97 applies to standard instrument approach procedures. It's the rule that makes instrument approach procedures, or IAPs, regulatory. The criteria used to develop IAPs is called TERPS. We've all heard about that. The criteria used to develop EOPs, or engine-out procedures, is aircraft performance data found in the regulations. It's important we understand what the Flight Standards responsibilities are regarding the development and use of standard IAPs and how they relate to engine-out operations. Altogether, Part 97 prescribes standard instrument approach procedures for instrument letdown to airports in the United States and the weather minimums that apply to takeoffs and landings under IFR at those airports. That's pretty much it, approach procedures and weather minimums. Now, this subpart, Section 97.20, prescribes the standard instrument procedures and weather takeoff minimums based on the criteria contained in an FAA Order 8260.3, which is the U.S. standard for terminal instrument procedures, or TERPS. There's other related orders in the 8260 series that also address instrument procedure design and criteria, such as 8260.19c, which is titled Flight Procedures in Airspace, which happens to belong solely to Flight Standards. Our AFS 420 branch in Oak City is the author and the keeper of that document. So what is Flight Standards' role in this whole world of instrument procedures? The Flight Standards Service is responsible for the use, and that's the operative word here, of air navigation facilities, appliances, not washers and dryers, and systems by aircraft operating in established environments and the National Airspace System, or the NAS. The responsibility includes governing policy, policy being the second operative word, and oversight of manual and automated development and maintenance of terminal and en route flight procedures. Under AFS 400, the principal element of the Flight Standards Service governing policies, criteria, and standards for establishing and maintaining terminal and en route flight procedures. This office is designated as the final authority to issue, amend, and appeal standard instrument procedures under 14 CFR Part 97. We do all the heavy lifting. The division is also responsible for the approval and disapproval of something called special instrument approach procedures we're going to talk about in a second, and requests for waivers of standards to those procedures. Now, AFS 410, which is the Flight Operations Branch, is the principal element of the division with respect to concepts, policy, systems, and programs associated with the operational and flight technical aspects of all weather operations. They do operational sanity checks, if you will, on waiver requests and special IAPs. The branch consists of a bunch of very experienced air carrier and FAA and military folks that have been around a long time, and they do a lot of operational mitigations of special IAPs. 410 also develops the concepts for the design, evaluation, and approval of Category 1, 2, and 3 approach and landing minimums, as well as lower than standard takeoff minimums. Some of you may have remembered we did an IVT on Cat 2 and Cat 3 approval last November. Now, AFS 420 in Oklahoma City, our sister branch from 410, is responsible for the rulemaking process. They actually write large portions of Part 97. They also are responsible for the development of criteria, and probably their prime responsibility, pertinent to the design of instrument flight procedures. They actually write the criteria that ends up in TERPs. They're responsible for the testing, data analysis, verification, and validation of nav systems and concepts, and also provide for the technical evaluation and risk assessment of proposed instrument operations not covered by standard criteria. AFS 420 is the primary interface, and that's a key issue here, between flight standards and what used to be AVN, Aviation System Standards. AVN is now AJW. A stands for FAA, J stands for ATO, or Air Traffic Organization, and W stands for Technical Operations. Makes sense to me. But AJW is the principal element within Airway Facilities Service, which falls under the Air Traffic Organization, directly responsible for the in-flight inspection of air navigation facilities and for the development and maintenance of instrument flight procedures throughout the United States and its territories. Specifically, AJW 32, which used to be AVN 100, is responsible for the development and maintenance of instrument flight procedures. These are the guys who actually build the procedures. AJW 33 is responsible for the in-flight inspection of air navigation facilities. They have numerous airplanes located at facilities around the country to perform this function. AJW 35, which used to be AVN 500, is the element responsible for the production and distribution of aeronautical charts and related publications and products. They're also referred to as the National Aeronautical Charting Office, or we know them as NACO. These are the guys that actually print the charts that come in the books that we have in our offices. So all these lines of business are involved in the development of instrument procedures, but it's important to understand that there are several different types of procedures that we all get involved in. Public instrument approach procedures, pretty much we just covered, are regulatory by CFR Part 97. They're incorporated by reference. CFR Part 97 is 3 pages long, but basically what it does is it says every public instrument approach procedure out there is a rule. And if you are issued, for example, an ILS approach in VMC conditions, you're expected to fly the approach as depicted in the procedure. And if you go missed approach, you're expected to fly, unless someone talks to you, the published missed approach procedure. Special IAPs are made regulatory by Order 8260-19C. That's the one that belongs to AFS 420 in Oak City, and that's a flight standards document signed by Jim Baylog. It's enabled by Part 97, so it's also regulatory. Those procedures are built according to TERPS criteria, they're flight checked, and they're approved by us here in Washington in AFS 400. Now, SIDS are developed by AJW, what used to be AVN. STARS, curiously enough, are still developed by air traffic. However, both are flight checked, TERPS criteria is applied for obstacle assessment, and they are not published initially in the NACO documents. They're published in something called the NIFTY, or the National Flight Data Digest. The NIFTY is a daily publication of flight information appropriate to aeronautical charts, aeronautical publications, NOTAMs, or other media serving the purpose of providing operational flight data essential to safe and efficient aircraft operations. Now, charted visual flight procedures are not instrument procedures and do not have missed approach segments. The DCA Reagan National Runway 19 River Approach that many people are familiar with at DCA, which is used probably 75% of the time during VMC conditions, has never been flight checked, has no missed approach segment, and would not meet TERPS criteria if it was so applied. There's a little thing called P56 there, and this Washington Monument that has something to say to TERPS. ATC will not issue clearances for charted visual flight procedures when the weather is less than the published minimum for that procedure. So 1,003 is not applicable here, 1,000 feet and 3 miles. DCA river approach requires 3 miles visibility, for example, and the controller asks the pilot when he has the river to state that, and then only then will the pilot be cleared for the river visual. The San Francisco Quiet Bridge visual, which many of you are familiar with, requires 5 miles visibility. So each charted visual flight procedure is spec'd out for its own specific visibility. Engine-out procedures, EOPs, that's the subject of this presentation, is developed by the operator, not the FAA. It's accepted by the POI, not approved by the POI. I will explain that a little bit later. So with all these new regulations in place and all these procedures and processes here, why do we need a new AC? While the airplane flight manual required by CFR Part 25 provides detailed instructions for determining the vertical clearance, it offers little guidance on the lateral or horizontal obstacle clearance requirements that the airplane needs to accomplish. This Air Advisory Circular provides information for determining safe horizontal clearance from obstacles for the actual flight path. The AC also provides guidance and acceptable lateral criteria to assist an operator in developing EOPs. It fills in that lack of a regulation for lateral guidance, if you will. So with this in mind, let's first look at the regulatory vertical obstacle requirements. CFR 25, the regulation that talks about aircraft certification. And in the case of large airplanes, we're talking CFR 25. It talks about something called gross and net flight paths. It's an aircraft certification requirement. All this really means is the aircraft must have the performance to get up and go and clear obstacles. Now, CFR Part 25 prescribes something called a minimum gross flight path of 2.4%. That's just a rise over run exercise where for every 100 feet you've got to be 2 feet in the air during the climb, or 2.4 feet in the air during the climb. CFR 25 also prescribes a second flight path called a minimum net flight path. It's basically the gross minus a 0.8% safety buffer that the FAA installed in that regulation many years ago. So the minimum net flight path equals 1.6%. And that's equivalent to something called a 62.5 to 1 slope. Now, I don't want to get all wrapped around the axle with these numbers because, like I said, we don't want to make you engineering or aeronautical engineering experts. I just want you to be aware that there's something called a net flight path out there because the 121-189 clearly states that the net flight path must clear all obstacles by 35 feet vertically. I can give you some information on the history of where some of these numbers came from, but the big mystery is the 35 feet one. One fella told me that the DC-3 has a 70-foot wingspan, and half of that is 35 feet. So if you leave 35 feet, you're now out of ground effect. And because these regulations were all promulgated in the late 40s or early 50s, that's why it's 35 feet. I don't know if that's true or not. You can take that anywhere you want with it, but it's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So let's take a picture, look at a picture of some of this stuff. We start with the runway and continue through the 3 climb segments. The airplane accelerates through V1, rotates at VR, and then must reach V2 before it hits 35 feet above the takeoff surface. The point at 35 feet is also called reference 0, because this is when segment 1 begins. Part 25 prescribes 3 segments in the climb out profile. Segment 1 begins at 35 feet, and the airplane should climb out at a speed as close as practical to, but not less than V2, until the selected acceleration height is reached. So this whole segment, the first and second segment, is flown at V2. The first segment ends when the landing gear is up and locked, and then the second segment begins. And the second segment is the gear is up, V2 speed is constant with this 2.4% minimum climb gradient I mentioned earlier. And then the flight path between these 2 extremes begins to vary quite a bit. As you get into the third segment climb, which is after 400 feet, 400 feet is the minimum altitude that the operator can start any configuration changes, such as retracting flaps or reducing airspeeds or anything else. But at any rate, after 400 feet, the operator has the capability of proceeding to the final 1,500 feet endpoint at V2 with takeoff thrust and takeoff flaps, which would be max performing the airplane the best it could possibly do. Or it has the capability, if it so desires, to level off at 400 feet, start the flap retraction process, and then get to the point where it can actually reduce to max continuous power. But you see in this example, that probably wouldn't be a good thing to do. The point is, between these 2 extremes of max power and V2 all the way to 1,500 feet, or cleaning up till max or 0 flap speed at 400 feet, is an infinite amount of climb profiles that the operator can choose to select. Most operators, as we know, go to about 1,000 feet and start on a normal profile and start the flap cleanup sequence. And after 1,000 feet, when there's VZF or flaps up speed, they'll select climb power and continue with the climb profile. Now remember, in those earlier slides we talked about the gross flight path. That's represented by this boulder line here on top, and this dim or thin, barely seen line down here in the bottom represents the net flight path, where that 0.8% subtractive buffer was put in. The net flight path must always clear either a man-made obstacle or an existing obstacle along this flight profile to 1,500 feet by a minimum of 35 feet. The takeoff flight path ends not lower than 1,500 feet for Part 25 and commuter category airplanes. I apologize for that old exercise, but sometimes this review will be helpful, and I think it will be for the coming presentation. Now we've covered the vertical. Let's talk about the horizontal obstacle clearance. So what does horizontal one-engine inoperative departure criteria mean? It means we shall ensure that there are no obstacles that will affect the aircraft net flight path with an engine failure. Now, some U.S. carriers use solely this CFR guidance prescribed in Part 121-189, which requires a net takeoff flight path that clears all obstacles by at least 200 feet horizontally within the airport boundaries and by at least 300 feet horizontally after passing the boundaries. The green stripe here, of course, represents the runway, and the net flight path must provide clearance 200 feet either side of the aircraft. Now, the way the rule reads is the airplane flight path. So the flight standards interpretation of this, to make this a realistic rule and useful for us, is that the interpretation of policy from our end is that the net takeoff flight path includes the wingspan of the airplane. So Boeing 747 with, say, a 212 wingspan would have to clear obstacles after the airport boundaries by a minimum of 300 feet laterally on each end of the wingtip. The new 380, I believe, has about a 276 wingspan, so that will require 300-foot obstacle clearance on the individual wingtip. Of course, a DC-9 or a 737 will have a smaller net takeoff flight path. The point here is the net takeoff flight path is not 1 inch wide. It's not the center line of the profile or the departure track. It's not the center line of the airplane. It's the wingspan. That's the width of the net flight path. These rules, by the way, were promulgated in August of 1941, before Pearl Harbor. Back then, the takeoff visibilities were so high that pilots could effectively navigate the ground track or the center line of the airplane because they had the visibility. For you R&P buffs, because this would be very tight if we didn't bring in this wingspan issue, 300 feet has an R&P value of just about 0.05, which makes it fairly useless unless we include this interpretation of ours. Because of these issues, most U.S. operators use a more conservative approach regarding obstacle clearance, and that's the primary reason that this advisory circular was written. That's what this AC is really all about. This AC fills in the gaps used by most air carriers. It incorporates the best industry practices to provide an operationally realistic horizontal clearance plane, and it provides for something called a 16-to-1 splay, reaching a maximum of plus or minus 2,000 feet. Don't worry about that because I'm going to explain that in a bit. Now, some U.S. carriers and Part 129 foreign carriers use a more conservative 8-to-1 splay, which includes a larger area to protect, and it reaches a max of plus or minus 3,000 feet. Now, these are difficult concepts to even imagine or envision just from these words, so I mean, who invented the word splay anyhow? But don't worry, I have another picture. This starts off with the CFR 200-300 span, obstacle clearance plane, but you can see we've included the wingspan as part of our policy, either side of the intended flight path. The advisory circular brings us into something called a 16-to-1 splay. And I'm going to explain this in a little bit more detail later, but basically it starts at the end of the runway, and as the airplane accelerates, it needs to have more obstacle clearance coverage, and so this splay will extend out. Now, these are just disconnects because the slide's not wide enough, otherwise it would be a smooth, ever-enlarging obstacle clearance area that eventually ends up at 2,000 feet either side of the net flight path. And then the splay is complete for the advisory circular deal. And I'm going to explain these 4,800 and 32,000 feet numbers later. I just wanted you to be aware that this allows for more obstacle clearance, and most of the U.S. carriers are using this method now. The ICAO splay is even more restrictive. It's represented by these magenta lines. You see, the AC was 16-to-1. The ICAO splay is actually an 8-to-1, so it encompasses a lot more area. Again, it starts at the end of the runway, and again, it has a disconnect, but it eventually gets out to a 3,000-foot off the net flight path on either side. We've been talking about one engine and operative engine-out procedures and horizontal or lateral protection from obstacles here. There's a whole other animal in this business called obstruction evaluation, or OE, that is conducted by the FAA. It's actually conducted by the Air Traffic Organization. But it's embodied in an entirely different process than we have been discussing. We've been discussing aircraft engine or performance requirements, which are standalone regulatory requirements. OE, or obstruction evaluation, involves only all engines operating procedures. And it's a normal way the FAA evaluates present and future obstacles in procedure design. What we're really talking about here is TERPS. Order 8260.3b, TERPS is standardized method for designing instrument flight procedures to avoid obstacles. Briefly, TERPS describes various horizontal and vertical protection surfaces for all engine instrument procedure design. The vertical surface is typically represented by a gross climb of 200 feet per nautical mile and an obstacle identification surface, something called an OIS, or its net surface in terps of 40 to 1. Now the 200 feet per nautical mile comes from adding the 152 feet per nautical mile, which accompanies the 40 to 1 slope, with a 48 foot per nautical mile obstacle clearance safety factor that the FAA has arbitrarily added. The horizontal surface typically splays at a 15-degree angle and typically a maximum width of plus or minus 2 nautical miles, as opposed to the 2,000 and 3,000 we saw in the previous slide. Now, the reason we briefly reviewed what TERPS criteria is important because of the differences with the aircraft performance criteria. With CFR performance criteria, SIDS, or departure procedures, are based on TERPS or ICAO PANSOPS as normal all-engines operating operations, period. Thus, one engine inoperative obstacle clearance requirements and the all-engines operating TERPS requirements are independent and exclusive. EOP's engine out procedures do not need to meet TERPS requirements. Furthermore, compliance with TERPS all engines operating climb gradient requirements does not necessarily assure that the one engine inoperative obstacle clearance requirements are met. To continue, TERPS typically use specified all engines operating climb gradients to an altitude in a linear fashion, rather than a certificated one engine inoperative airplane performance requirements, which are segmented. You remember the slide with the 3 segmented climb on the profile. Operators must comply with 14 CFR requirements for every takeoff and for the development of takeoff performance data and procedures. TERPS typically assume a climb gradient of 200 feet per nautical mile, unless a greater gradient is specified, but operators must comply with the 14 CFR requirements, 121 189, to account for the differences between TERPS and engine out criteria, including the lateral and vertical obstacle clearance requirements. This, folks, is what we call in the business the numbers. When you're in your jump seat doing an en route inspection, or maybe in a previous life you had a window seat in a turbojet airplane, large air carrier type airplane, no takeoff was ever completed until you got the numbers. The numbers were your zero fuel weight, typically your V speeds, your trim settings, your max landing weight. Maybe there were some other numbers that were included in there, but anything that had to do with 121, 189 is included in the numbers. You may get them from your dispatch through ACARS. The first officer may be the one with a laptop computer that completes the number deal, but the fact remains is nobody goes until you get the numbers. The bottom line is this: an engine failure during takeoff is a non-normal condition and therefore takes precedence over noise abatement, air traffic, SIDS, departure procedures, and other normal operating considerations. Now, with these concepts in mind, let's take a look at what engine out procedures are not. They are not developed according to TERPS or PANSOPS criteria. Can't stress that too clear. They do not provide takeoff data such as decision and performance airspeeds, just limiting gross weights. EOPs do not provide standard ATC departure routing, the engine out emergency use only routing. EOPs are not developed or flight checked by AGW, which used to be AVN in Oklahoma City. They are not flight checked using our AFS 420 criteria. They're not promulgated under CFR Part 97, so they're not incorporated by reference. So therefore, engine out procedures are not approved. There's no regulatory requirement for them. So now they are not approved by the FAA, but in fact accepted by the FAA. POI, just like portions of the airplane flight manual. You know, there's 4 areas that are approved in the airplane flight manual, but system design pages or descriptions of hydraulic system, electrical system, those sorts of things, those things are all accepted by the POI. And if the EOP is associated with a special IAP that involves unique terrain or pilot flight skills, the following now applies. With a special operations package, this is for special procedures only, there will be an AFS 410 Flight Operations Branch Form 8260-10. Now the 8260 forms accompany each instrument procedure package, whether it's a special or a public, and there's a number of them. And they go through all their processes before eventually a 35 or 40-page package is developed for one procedure. This is the information that ultimately ends up on the desk at Jepson. Jepson takes the exact information contained in there, and that's how they print their approach plates. Jepson does not develop instrument procedures. The FAA does. The POI shall not issue op specs to an operator authorizing this special instrument approach procedure until at least the following two conditions are met to the satisfaction of the All-Weather Operations Program Manager, or AWO, that has geographic responsibility for this special IAP. The operator shall develop an engine-out procedure for this special IAP, and the operator shall have fully implemented the EOP for this procedure in the dispatch system, flight operations manuals as appropriate, training program, and aircraft maintenance program as appropriate. We've seen what EOPs are. Now let's take, let's take a look at what EOPs are. They use the CFR performance requirements and concepts, the airplane flight manual information, and other aircraft performance data. They can increase allowable packs and cargo load and safety margins. The primary reason for developing these procedures is to maximize the takeoff weight for the carriers and to maximize the safety margins for the FAA, for us. They provide escape routing when necessary from normal ATC departure routing in the event of an engine loss or similar performance degrade. A similar performance degrade would be, for example, if you took off in a mountainous airport, you couldn't get the landing gear or the flaps up. They're developed by the operator's performance engineering department or an external source contractor. They're not developed by the FAA. There's many of these contractors available, by the way. So let's see what goes into the development of an engine-out procedure process. First, in order for the operator to determine that a departure maintains the necessary obstacle clearance with an engine failure, the operator should consider that an engine failure may occur at any point on a departure flight path. Very important. Second, the most common procedure to maximize takeoff weight when significant obstacles are present along normal departure routing is to use an engine-out procedure routing in the event of an engine failure takeoff on takeoff. Obstacles along this track are used to determine the maximum allowable takeoff weight for that runway. The most important consideration for an operator developing these procedures is the determination of obstacles. This advisory circular provides this guidance when considering obstacles. Frangible structures need not be considered. Operators should use reasonable judgment to account for the height of something called indeterminate objects, like trees or objects without recorded height. Operators shall take into account local, temporary, or transient obstacles such as ships, cranes, or trains. There are many sources of obstacle data, and I'm just going to put up a list of some here. I'm not going to read them all, but obviously obstruction charts and airport 5010s. The Air Force and DOD provide some obstacle data. There's a lot of data in the geodetic surveys, terrain data forms, and there's other information coming available. Satellite imagery is becoming a very valuable tool, and I think it will be increasingly so in the future. Of primary importance in the engine-out procedure analysis is determining the end of the takeoff segment. I mean, you don't have to worry about this stuff anymore. For the purpose of the takeoff obstacle clearance analysis, the end of the takeoff flight path is considered to occur when one of these things happen. The airplane has reached the minimum crossing altitude at a fixed or minimum en route altitude for a route to the intended destination, or the airplane is able to comply with en route obstacle clearance requirements, or the airplane has reached the minimum vectoring altitude or a fix in altitude from which an approach to the departure airport could be initiated. When determining the limiting takeoff weight, the obstacle analysis should be carried out to the end of the takeoff segment as defined above. Now, one of the primary purposes of this AC is to provide clear methods of analysis, to fill that gaping hole in the regulation. Sections 121, 189, 135, 379, and 135, 398 require that the net takeoff flight path, we talked about the net takeoff flight path, that was that dim line that cleared by 35 feet, vertically and 200 feet laterally inside the airport boundary or 300 feet laterally outside the airport boundary, plus the wingspan. We've mentioned the CFR net takeoff vertical flight path requirements. This advisory circular focuses on two methods that may be used to identify and ensure lateral clearance of critical obstacles. These methods are called the area analysis method and the flight track analysis method. First, we're going to look at the area analysis method. The area analysis method defines an obstacle accountability area. That's a new term that comes along with this advisory circular, OAA, within which all obstacles must be cleared vertically. The OAA is centered on the intended flight track with a minimum of 200 inside and 300 outside the airport boundary and a maximum of 2,000 feet paralleling the net takeoff track. That all sounds confusing enough, but let me give you the diagram that is in the AC itself. Now, you see it when we start at the runway here, the 200 and 300 feet corridor, if you will, is regulatory and controlling. Then at 4,800 feet, the 16-to-1 splay starts to widen out, actually meets the 300 feet edge of the corridor and begins to spread out. Now, the reason, you have these splays anyhow is because as the airplane accelerates on the net flight path, it's going to need more obstacle clearance area because it's just simply going faster. This 4,800 feet comes from taking this number here. You see the D is the distance along the intended flight path from the end of the runway in feet, and a 16-to-1 splay equates to something called 0.0625 times D. So if you take 4,800 feet times 0.0625, I'll do the math for you, it equals 300 feet. That's the point where you bust through the regulatory 300-foot plus wingspan corridor. If you take 32,000 feet times 0.625, it equates to 2,000 feet. And at this point, the splay turns and parallels the net flight path. And then the 2,000 feet either side of the net flight path becomes a parallel protective function. So the width of the OAA is this 0.0625 feet D on each side of the extended track, where D is the distance along the intended flight path from the end of the runway in feet, except when limited by the minimum and maximum widths of 200, 300 at the airport and 2,000 at this 30,000 feet point out here. Apologize for this jerky slide. This is the area analysis method for a straight-out departure. And the deal here is that all obstacles within this area must be cleared by 35 feet. Now, when you take the area analysis method next step further, and you see what do you have to do when you are required to turn after departure, we're going to take a look at that. During turns, the following criteria apply. During departures involving turns of the intended track, or when the airplane heading is more than 15 degrees from the extended runway centerline heading, the following criteria apply. The initial straight segment, if any, has the same width as a straight-out departure. The width of the obstacle accountability area at the beginning of the turning segment is the greater of 300 feet on each side of the intended track plus the wingspan, which is the regulatory and controlling requirement, or the width of the OAA at the end of the initial straight segment, if there is one. Say they had a straight segment, it would be this width here, if that's what you ended up as. Or the width of the end of the immediately preceding segment, if there is one, which is analyzed by something called the flight track analysis method, which I haven't talked about yet. We're going to talk about that in a second. So anyway, the way the turn begins is based on what's connected to it at the front end. Well, let's take a look at a picture of this. This is in the advisory circular also. Now here's starting from the runway. It's the same width as the straight-out departure we just looked in the previous slide. And you go out and everything's exactly the same until you get to the start of the turn here. Now remember this 0.0625D, which prescribed the 16-to-1 clearance splay for the straight-out departure. You need more room for maneuvering and winds and so forth. So in this case, the clearance plane is doubled to an 8-to-1 ratio, and it's actually got this number involved in it, which is 0.25 times D. And I'm not sure, but I think that's twice this. But at any rate, in the turn, Thereafter, in turning segments, the width of the OA increases by this 0.125 distance. D is the distance along the intended flight path from the beginning of the first turning segment in feet, except when limited by the following maximum width, which is 3,000 feet on either side of the intended track. And remember, the previous straight-out departure only went to 2,000 feet. So to get an idea of what this is all about, using this 0.125 number, if you take the start of the turn here, by the time you get to 3,000 feet parallel obstacle clearance, I did the math for you, it equals about 24,000 feet after the start of the turn, or about 4.5 miles, or 4.5 miles. Now again, this was something called the area analysis method. Let's take a look at an example of this area analysis method. This is Colorado Springs. On the right is the ILS for 35 less. It's a conventional procedure. This is a public procedure. Now notice I'm going to read, because it may be difficult for you to read, but I'm going to read the missed approach procedure for you, indicated by the dashed line. This is called the Black Forest VOR up here where the hold is. And just for background, the field elevation is around 6,100 feet. And the missed approach says climb to 8,000 feet, then a climbing right turn to 9,000 feet, direct the Black Forest VOR and hold. So you basically head up toward the rocks north of Sea Springs, and you enter the hold up here. Well, if you experience an engine loss in going into Colorado Springs, you probably are going to have a difficult time this close gaining 3,000 feet in altitude and getting into the holding pattern. So the airline has developed something called a engine out procedure, which is accepted by the POI. That beauty's right over here. For 3-5 left, and we're looking at the diagram in the center here that has this right turn. It says allowable takeoff weights for runway 35 left are based on a 15-degree banked climbing right turn commenced at 5 DME off the ILS localizer upon crossing the Black Forest 203 radial, which is this little radial right there. Then you continue on a right turn to 170 degrees and skedaddle out of the mountainous regime and continue climb and advise ATC. So here's an engine out procedure that would be using the area analysis method that I just described to you before. Now I have a video of this that some fine folks have built for us. I think this is a 777, but this is the Colorado Springs engine out procedure, and we'll just watch the little airplane fly here. You can see in the 3-5 left is here, 3-5 right is up here. This is actually topography that's laid over a sectional. As this opens up on the right side, it shows you the procedure. The engine out miss will be indicated by the red line. This little green pipper is the 777 as it approaches the runway. You're going to see him hit the runway and commence the missed approach here. And then you're going to see the right turn at this waypoint. These can all be installed in the FMS, the waypoints and the misses. This whole engine out procedure can be conducted with this course guidance, in this case, hitting these waypoints, and on the autopilot. It makes it almost an effortless, no-brainer procedure for the... Here's the high hills over here that you see west of the Sea Springs Airport. And the airplane escapes back down into relatively low terrain. That was the area analysis method. The second analysis method is called the flight track analysis method. The flight track analysis method involves analyzing the ground track of the flight path. The flight track analysis method is an alternative means of defining an obstacle accountability area, that OAA again, based on the navigational capabilities of the aircraft. This methodology requires the operator to evaluate the effect of wind and available course guidance on the actual ground track. To continue, 3 factors that the operator must consider in performing a flight track analysis are pilotage and turns. The operator should consider the ability of a pilot to initiate and maintain a desired speed and bank angle in a turn. This is where simulation and testing come into effect. Winds are extremely important in the flight track analysis method because it tends to give you some tighter approach clearance capability. But when using the flight track analysis method, operators should take into account winds that may cause the airplane to drift off the intended track. This method provides a tighter area of obstacle clearance. Wind factors are not required to be assessed in the previous method, the area analysis method we previously looked at, but they are here in the flight track analysis method. One of the beautiful aspects of this method, of the flight track analysis method, is you can start using things in the airplane for course guidance. You can take, operators may take credit for available course guidance when calculating the lateral location of the actual flight track relative to the intended track as part of a flight track analysis. Now, the advisory circular provides this criteria for these traditional ground aids. You see they're fairly tight, localizer 1.25 degree splay, and these would go into the development of the flight track escape maneuver. The one that really cracks me up is the DME fix, plus or minus 1 minimum instrument display increment, but not less than plus or minus 0.25 nautical miles. Now, you got to understand that this advisory circular was in draft form for 5 years. I'm sorry, for 13 years, and 5 guys at least, maybe more, worked on it. And I know for a fact that 2 are dead, so I think they got a little bit wired when they got down to some of these issues. But at any rate, the concept is sound and it's beautiful. And I like this next slide a lot. There's also an allowance for the airplane performance-based area navigation capabilities. Now we're getting into this century's airplanes and the next iteration of technology that's coming upon us, namely at R&P issues. But airplane-based area navigation refers to a system, and a system to us today means performance-based, like FMS, GPS, RNAV, R&P, or IRS system, that permit airplane operations on any desired course, including a turn expansion for a flyby or flyover waypoint, without direct course guidance from a ground-based nav aid. The minimum allowance is the demonstrated accuracy of the airplane-based navigation system. But we must always remember that there's still a regulation out there, and that under no circumstances can the obstacle accountability area, half width, be reduced to less than the regulatory minimum of 200 feet within the airport boundaries and 300 feet plus the wingspan after passing the boundaries. I love this analysis method because it's very pilot friendly. It lets an air carrier pilot use his autopilot, fly with absolute course guidance, know exactly where he is, and take it easy in the cockpit. That should be our job for everything these days. But let's take a look at an example of flight track analysis. This is a work in progress. We've almost got it completed. It's the Reno ILS. It may be, as a matter of fact, completed as I speak today. It's been very close. This is the Reno ILS to 16 right. The beauty of this approach is that it is a conventional ILS using conventional TERPS ILS clearance criteria. It's a special, so it has some waivers involved. But then when you get to the missed approach point, this dotted line means it's a RNAV FMS missed approach. This is where we're going to get our course guidance on the miss. Let's look at this missed approach, this dotted line section down here, in a little more detail. This is actually what the missed approach looks like in the FMS box. It consists of these several waypoints that basically, after the runway is missed, bring the airplane around for a rather sharp left-hand turn, because the hills around Reno are out in this area, and the airplane on the autopilot, engine out, or in this case all engines operating, flies the same procedure. Flies the same procedure. Notice the max crosswind limit is 30 knots, and the max speed until reaching the northmost waypoint to get you straight. In other words, the max speed during this turn is 170 knots. These are the kinds of things we can do in this arena to get these things under control. The most beautiful thing about this approach is the pilot gets to the missed approach point, he flips a switch on the dashboard from VOR ILS to LNAV and lets the autopilot do its thing as it flies him up out of there. The other great thing is this particular engine out procedure at Reno requires a 308 feet per nautical mile, where the old conventional wild EOPs that I've seen out there had as much as 780 or 800 feet per nautical mile. So this is truly an elegant solution and something we ought to be pursuing in the future. I've actually got a video of this one here. This procedure was developed and contracted by Aloha Airlines, and they were kind enough to give me permission to use this procedure. I've actually asked that we be able to use their procedure that they paid for to provide the other airlines that go into Reno that have the GPS capability to fly this RNAV track miss, and they've said absolutely yes, because safety is the first concern. So really our applause goes to Aloha Airlines. But I want to look at the video that MITRE developed for us, and you can see here's Reno here, and I'm going to take you there in a Aloha 737 even. This is the topography around Reno Airport as we're approaching the 16 right runway to the left. You can see the incredible mountainous terrain. This is what we're going to be avoiding over here on the miss. Down in the valley here are the runways. Here's 16 left and 16 right. You can see the green pipper here as the airplane hits these waypoints on the ILS final. When we get here, it's going to follow after the pod that goes to LNAV these missed approach waypoints and make this turn here. And it's really quite dramatic. And it's a good video to watch, so I'll just stay with you here. Here's the airplane starting the missed approach, coming down to Suyur and Tuyan. And then here's the range of hills that this 170 knot limitation is designed to keep you clear of. You can see this turn comes back around. And then when he gets to this Waksaman here, it's sort of a dramatic right turn to keep him out of these hills. And you see he'll come up here and get the Udis, and he'll actually take this shortest or lowest terrain here section out over the lake. One ops engineering guy described it as me. He said, look, you get a chart like this with all the bumps that represent the mountains, and you just take a string and you put it down the valley of the easiest way to get out of there without the highest climb rate, and then you basically take that string and see if you can make an airplane fly it. So that's typically what we've done here. That's a beautiful video. Lots of folks wonder if you can use these analysis methods in VMC conditions. And the answer is absolutely yes. Visual ground reference navigation is another form of course guidance. However, to take advantage of visual course guidance, a flight track analysis must be performed. Now, the ability to laterally avoid obstacles by visual reference can be very precise. The charted visual flight procedures are similar examples of how precise they could be. Can you imagine not being precise coming down the Potomac River into Washington, D.C. these days? But it's easy. And I remember a procedure back in my other life where we took off out of 27 in Boston, and we had a very noise-sensitive departure procedure up there that we had a visual depiction of a golf course that was out north of the airport that we could fly directly over the 9th hole, and if we knew where the 9th hole was in the fairway that took us to the 9th hole, you were absolutely sure to be on the center line of the departure. So we all became 9th hole experts. If the obstacles can be seen and are apparent, it's the operator's responsibility to assure that you operate in weather conditions consistent, of course, with the use of the visual ground reference points. To take advantage of the visual course guidance, the flight crew should be able to continuously determine and maintain the correct flight path with respect to ground reference points, so as to provide a safe clearance with respect to obstructions in terrain. It's just common sense. The procedure should be well defined with respect to ground reference points, so the track to be flown can be analyzed for obstacle clearance requirements. And to continue a little bit with the visual business, an unambiguous written and or pictorial description of the procedures, including the 9th hole, if appropriate, must be provided for crew use. The limiting environmental conditions, such as wind sealing, visibility, daylight conditions, or so forth, must be specified for the use of the procedure so the flight crew is able to visually acquire ground reference navigation points and navigate with respect to those points. Now, there are lots of other considerations in the AC. I'd call them cats and dogs, but they're important when it comes to the development of these engine-out procedures. Here's some of the additional considerations. Unless otherwise authorized, the airplane flight manual data must be used for one engine inoperative takeoff analysis. This is something you as a POIs can be checking on. It is recognized that many AFMs generally contain only the one engine inoperative performance for loss of an engine at V1 on takeoff to 1,500 feet. This can be a major issue in mountainous terrain. Operators may find appropriate acceptable data in various sources, such as, believe it or not, community noise documents, performance engineers' handbooks, flight characteristics manuals, and manufacturers' computer programs, which is probably the most often purchased thing. All the contractors out there usually have performance data for the airplanes in excess of 1,500 feet. The terrain and obstacles at certain airports may require a higher than standard cleanup altitude to be used and may still allow acceleration and cleanup to be accomplished within the takeoff thrust time limit, usually a 5-minute limit. Here's a couple more considerations. Consideration should be given to conducting a validation flight to confirm flight crew's ability to fly the actual special one-engine inoperative departure and to uncover any potential problems associated with those procedures, particularly if they differ significantly from the all-engine operating procedure or if terrain makes course guidance questionable at the one-engine inoperative altitude. Of course, none of these validation flights could be conducted as a revenue flight. That wouldn't work. If an actual validation flight in an airplane is required, it's recommended the pre-validation flight or flights be conducted in a simulator to simulate actual evaluation or validation conditions. We found that simulators are invaluable, and the Reno Aloha one was a perfect example of being able to do these analyses almost completely in the simulators. Even if you don't have the visual scenes available, because you're talking about someplace like Valdez, Alaska, you still have the aircraft performance capabilities, and you can work on the waypoint development for your engine out procedure extraction maneuver. Acceptable techniques used for these flights, these validation flights, would be initiating the procedure from a low pass, for example, over the runway at configuration speeds and altitudes that represent takeoff conditions. What we're getting at here is we don't want to see someone do a V1 cut and try to see if they can clear the hills. These are alternative methodologies. Number two, using a power setting on all engines calculated to give a thrust-weight ratio representative of one engine in operative conditions. This way you have all the engines spooled in case you really do need them. Or then setting one engine to flight idle to give a thrust-weight ratio representative of one engine in operative conditions. It's extremely important to supply flight crews with clear, unambiguous information on these engine out procedures. Flight crews must receive instructions through an appropriate means regarding these procedures. Now, usually, based on the complexity, this instruction could be done through flight operations bulletins, revisions to selected manuals, takeoff charts, NOTAMs, or special ground or simulator training requirements. Now, EOP's engine out procedures do not eliminate the need for flight crew engine out briefings. We're talking here in normal air carrier 121 and 135 operations, the JEP 10-7 page. How or when to transition from an ATC IFR departure to an EOP routing is a key crew coordination item, a briefing item. EOP routings may differ significantly from ATC IFR departure routings, as we saw in the Colorado Springs example. Now, continue here, the operator's instruction should advise flight crews of the following. This may be accomplished as a general policy for all airports, with exceptions stated as applicable or specified for each airport. But at least you ought to be covering speeds, especially relative to V2 and bank angles to be flown, both in all engines operating and one engine inoperative considerations. The intended track in case of an engine failure must be very clear. Some operators have a standard policy of flying runway heading after an engine failure. Others routinely assume the all engines operating ground track unless specifically stated otherwise. In any case, the intended track should be apparent to the flight crew, and failure at any point along the track should be taken into account. The points along the flight path at which the flap retraction sequence and the thrust reduction are to be initiated. And we'll make a note here that operators should incorporate procedures for converting required climb gradients to required climb rates in pilot and dispatcher airplane performance sections of their approved training programs. And this should be done because last time I checked, I didn't have a feet per nautical mile gauge on my dashboard up there. But here's an example of one deal that I remembered. I can remember three things, and this is one of them. At 180 knots, you're going 3 miles per minute. 60 into 180 is 3. I can do that. If the chart says that you need to maintain 500 feet per nautical mile on the departure procedure, and I do it at 180 knots, that's going to equate to 1,500 feet per minute, 3 times 500. I can do that on my vertical speed indicator. That's the kind of simple thing that we pilots usually like to store away up there. Now, this advisory circular addresses some very important concepts that significantly impact EOP procedure development. Namely, that there's a difference in what a missed approach is, and what a rejected landing means, and what a balked landing means. Let's take a quick look. Parts 121 and 135 do not specifically require an obstacle clearance analysis for one engine inoperative missed approaches or rejected landings. It's the classic missing rule. In subpart of I, part 121, that has these rules. There are only 3 of them. One is for losing an engine on takeoff, one for losing an engine during cruise, and one for losing an engine and deciding where you're going to land. There's no rules in there that govern what you should do if you're on a missed approach. And it goes back to the history of the promulgation of these regulations. Again, it was the main concern was not losing the engine on takeoff. It was being in your DC-3 going over the Rocky Mountains and losing an engine and how far you drift down and where you're going to land. That was the concern, because it was a performance issue from cruise. The intent of the advisory circular is to identify the best option or options for a safe lateral ground track and flight path to follow in the event that a missed approach, balk landing, rejected landing, or go around is necessary. A one engine inoperative missed approach from the minimum descent altitude or the decision height or above can frequently be flown following the published missed approach procedure. A rejected landing, however, starts from a lower altitude and may require some other procedure. For example, you may have to follow the same one engine inoperative procedure used for takeoff. There's another animal in this mix called a balked landing. A balked landing starts at the end of the touchdown zone. Touchdown zone is typically considered to be the first 1/3 of the available landing distance, or 3,000 feet, whichever is less. When appropriate for the purposes of this provision, operators may propose to use a different designation for a touchdown zone. We've covered a whole bunch of information in this interactive video training and information sharing session. I know it's come hot and heavy. I know when I was 12 years old and I told my mother that I wanted to be a pilot, if she said I would have had to know all this stuff, I think I would have gone to bartender school or something. But anyway, as flight standards inspectors, it's important that we at least know about the concepts that are covered in this summary here. 120 OBS, the advisory circular that was 13 years in draft, is now AC 120-91. Takeoff and initial climb out airport obstacle analysis and engine out procedures. We've sort of beat it to death today. I think it's important that you have the concept well in hand. It delineates between TERPs and the requirements and aircraft performance requirements in the CFR. And then most importantly, it introduces 2 methods the operators use to identify and ensure the clearance of critical obstacles: the area analysis method and the flight track analysis method. So that's the end of the video training or interactive video training session. I'd be happy to take your questions or comments, and I believe we have a phone bridge line already set up. That's my name and my horsepower. My understanding is that this video presentation will be available on the FAA Library website probably within the next few days. So we'll be happy to take your questions, and I hope my pals are on the horn at their locations. Hello? Somebody out there?
Yeah, Schwarzkopf and Turkey here from AFS 420.
Yes, sir. Hello? Anybody out there?
Yeah, this is... Hello?
Yes.
This is John Martin. How are you?
Hi, John.
I had two questions, and then one of my colleagues here has a question. For the engine-out procedures, you talked about a validation requirement. What's the basis of us telling them that they have to validate that procedure in the airplane or in the simulator?
There's really, no regulatory basis to any of these things. It may be an agreement you make with the carrier. I would hope that you'd be able to accomplish all this work in a simulator. That's pretty much what Aloha was able to do in that Reno example. There may be occasions where they just don't have the capability in their simulator, or it's too expensive for the airline to install the capabilities, and therefore they'll choose to, usually on their own, to go out and do it in the airplane. That's been our experience.
Okay, one other question is that the information for the engine-out departures that we're talking about, do you consider that to be aeronautical information that needs to be described in that op-spec paragraph 8 or 9 or 10 or whatever it is?
No, I would keep that out of the op specs because, like I said, we want to keep this basically as a process that is accepted by the POI rather than approved. Because getting it into the op specs, I think, would be a bad idea.
Okay.
And for obvious reasons. But the airlines have been doing this for a number of years, and it's successful. I mean, it works, and it's a viable alternative. But we just wanted to make sure that the ops inspectors out there were aware that it even existed. I appreciate your question.
Okay, thanks a lot. And I think that's all we got here.
Okay, John.
Hello, Kobe. Norm Lefevre.
Hello, Norm.
Hey, Kobe, I've got an issue with, I think it was slide 46.
Okay.
You have them calculate a foot per minute climb gradient. What's pilot going to do with that? He's in the process of an engine failure extraction. He is at his power setting. He's at his airspeed. He calculates he should get 1,500 feet per minute. He looks down and has 1,200 feet per minute. What does he do? I mean, what good does that,
Well, that's a good question, Norm. But first of all, when we used to brief this in my old life, we would do this calculation in the pre-approach briefing when we're briefing the 10.7 page. It says 500 feet per nautical mile. That means we've got to have 1,500 feet per minute. Now, the issue on 1,200 feet per minute, if that's all he's getting out of his airplane, he should not be flying this approach in the first place. He should not have been dispatched to be at that weight that's going to give him that limiting climb capability. So, I mean, that's all worked out up front in that whole section I referred to as the numbers. He's not supposed to be there in the first place.
Okay, I agree with all that. I agree wholeheartedly, and I'd like to make the point, though, you're wasting everybody's time. He ought to be better trained briefing what the procedures are, what the airspeeds are, etc., rather than calculating a number that if he doesn't get it, there's not a darn thing he can do about it if he has been dispatched in error.
Okay, well, point taken, Norm, but if he's dispatched in error, then that's a whole other issue. But they do get the training out there, believe me. They do the engine-out procedures in the simulator. They talk about it. And the important thing, we think, is that they thoroughly brief the procedure and the escape maneuver prior to the approach. Now, if the airplane is not performing the way it's supposed to be when he's at that point in the flight, that's a whole other issue. But thanks. Do you have anything you want to say down in 420, Larry?
No, we're fine.
Okay.
Hey, Kobe, Dave Butterfield, Western Pacific.
Hey, Dave, how are you?
Good. Good. We got a couple of questions here. The first one, if you have an FMS that has a published missed approach, that's different from the engine out extraction procedure. How does the pilot switch over from one to the other on the FMS?
That's a good point, Dave. They have, as you know, as an old Airbus guy, the capability to put a second procedure underlying the primary that you could switch to. Is that not right? You know what I mean? In other words, you have a
Yes, it is.
secondary flight plan, which would be the part of, in my opinion, would be part of the briefing. If we lose an engine and we go to this alternative procedure, we'll go into this next page and you brief that. I can't think really of any other way to explain that. But if the procedure is just a piece of paper, then as you know from your previous experience, when we briefed the 10.7 pages, you briefed the instrument approach procedure first, and then you had the alternative procedure, the 10.7 procedure, we briefed second, and both pieces of paper stayed on our clipboard in the event of an engine failure. But you're right, on the FMC thing, there's really not an easy explanation for that.
Okay, great. The way you were phrasing it, I thought something new had come out that I hadn't seen.
No. I mean, I think the technology is there to get and maybe, you know, it's something that'll evolve next that in the course of the briefing we'll be going to the next page in the event of an engine failure as part of our procedure. I don't know, you know, but anything to make it easy for the pilot.
Great, thanks. And Terry Griffin wants to talk to you now.
Okay, hi, Terry.
Hi, Kobe. There are a number of questions I have. Number one, regarding Reno, this is a quantum shift from a year ago, where 410 non-concurred with our response on a hotline complaint, stating that these emergency procedures are designed but anyway, we had no business putting it in the Dash 10, and now you put it specifically in the Dash 10 that they must develop an engine out extraction. Another thing. If in the Dash 10 we're telling them to develop an engine out extraction procedure acceptable to the AWO PM, that makes that specific engine out extraction procedure part of the special. If it's part of the Dash 10, then it becomes that part of the procedure, which is confusing to me. I mean, and it's going to be confusing to operators, BOIs, and on top of which, we have a number of operators out there with the present Dash 10 that does not make this requirement. And is this going to be retroactive? Are we going to be looking at currently approved specials and having to go back in and ask them to develop an engine?
No, you know the history of this as well as anybody, Terry. But the fact remains is that the new Dash 10 has this canned statement on it that references a engine out procedure, which is a separate document. It's not part of the special. The Dash 10 is part of the special, and all it says is you've got to have something else. So that's what they develop. In this particular Reno case, as you know, this procedure also is a missed approach for the all engines operating one, so it's very unique in that case. As far as your question about retroactivity, this policy that we're putting on a Dash 10 that brings the AWO into the concurrence mode has to do with some experiences we've had in the past with some folks in the field actually changing the 8267 forms that cannot be changed because they're signed by AFS 400 and become law then. You can't dash it across a T or dot an I once that thing is signed by AFS 400. And that's one of the issues that came up. But the bottom line is that new guidance will come out coincidentally with the 8260 19D. Right now the current change is C, and the D is soon to come. Maybe Tom Schneider can extrapolate on that a little bit. But the fact is, the statement on the Dash 10 is simply that And the actual procedure is not part of the special. We disagree with that. And second of all, it's not retroactive to old engine out procedures. You don't have to go back and have new ones developed or any other coordination. They're basically grandfathered. The bottom line here is that we want the AWOs involved, especially in the mountainous regions, with POIs who are involved with these sorts of procedures. And that's about all I got to say on that.
Gary Larson, Seattle Aircraft Evaluation Group.
Oh boy, here we go. I was a psych major, Gary, so be easy.
Yeah, I appreciate being able to sit in on this. Two comments, actually. One is the feedback is pretty hard to deal with, and I think that may explain some of the hesitations. Are you still with me?
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm not experiencing any feedback here.
Yeah, we are.
Okay.
No. Yeah, we are out here, so that's the issue. But the other thing is I've dealt with some steep approach issues with some of the airplanes I worked in the AEG, and we've had an issue that we've tried to hold the feet to the fire on, and that is the balk landing, particularly from a steep angle of descent. And what we referred to in particular is AC 12029A, which of course speaks to steep approach. It also speaks in some detail to the balk landing. I recognize an AC is not a regulation or a strict requirement, but I just wonder, A, how closely you folks have worked with that, and how familiar some of the POIs may be. I know that John Martin asked a question is sort of, again, how do we entice the carriers or enforce on the carriers that they do this kind of calculation. So I'll just take your response off air here.
Okay, I'll tell you that really the AC 12091, which used to be 120 OBS for years and years, is, other than the 29A, is really the only point of reference that I have for even the discussion of balk landing. I don't know where it's talking. Maybe in 8410, I haven't looked in there, but it has not been an area of detail, and I can appreciate your concerns about those issues coming from the AEG. I'm not exactly sure how you entice an operator to play with the balk landing issues. That's a good point. The main reason for the discussion in this presentation was to get POIs or operations inspectors out there to think about there's a lot more than missed approaches and go-arounds involved with this, especially when you're initiating an engine out procedure development issue. You may have to start the engine out procedure development, you know, in a different way, different manner, because you're at a different altitude than a regular missed approach point. That's about all I can give you on that.
If I could just interject one more little bit.
Sure.
I guess the leverage you could say that we've used is the training, approval of the training. And I know there's even been some push and pull or tug of war over who owns training or who owns the recommendations for training. Obviously, the POIs sign off the training program, and that's one of the few approved, things that airlines do which are approved. But that's one of the ways we've done it, and we've said, you've got to demonstrate that you can do this and your training is adequate. But I can assure you it hasn't always been received with open arms, particularly when we talk about a balk landing and we say that's an engine out balk landing, because that could indeed be the reason you're balking. So anyway, for what it's worth, that's how we've used to try to use some leverage.
Okay, yeah, I agree with you completely. I wonder if the Flight Ops Evaluation Board or Flight Standardization Board, certainly they, for new airplanes, have a lot to say about what training requirements may be required, and that may be another place too.
Yeah, that usually ends up in the FSB report in some fashion or an addendum to it for that particular operator. But again, that's an advisory thing. I mean, the POI can accept that or reject it. We try to bring the POIs in on some of these evaluations, of course, or usually we are asked in by them. But as you say, there's no clear regulatory requirement other than sort of the long-standing traditional feeling that if someone is going to buy a ticket, that they're entitled to know that should they lose an engine somewhere along the route of flight, that's not a death sentence. That's sort of the basis by which we design and control operation in commercial service.
Right, and certainly that directs a lot of our policy and everything like that, but unfortunately I can't put a regulatory number on that concept. It would be nice to have that. But thanks a lot for that input, because that's something I'm going to personally look into. I've become interested in this whole concept. I think our guys out there need to have some more clarification and guidance on what it really involves. Appreciate your help on that. Anyone else out there? Ed Robinson, do you have anything for the crowd?
Nope, nothing for me, except Terry Griffin's question was about applying newer updated criteria to existing procedures. And that would only happen if a procedure came forward for review or maintenance.
Okay, I understand that. And I guess, I don't know, are you experiencing a lot of feedback issues on this audio?
Yeah, the phone line's working about 5 seconds faster than the satellite.
Okay. Anyone else out there for this IVT on airport obstacle analysis?
Yeah, Kobe, Norm Lefevre again.
Hi, Norm.
Kind of responding to Terry, I can give you some information on how we plan to use the new .19. For example, at Aspen, we have all of our current operators but one who are required to meet the engine out climb gradient for the TERPS procedure with an engine out. And what this new criteria will allow us to do is to actually allow them to do an obstacle evaluation similar to the advisory circular here, and actually allow them to increase their payload. So our intent, once we have the new .19 in hand, is to come back in, get the -10 changed to have that wording put in, and then allow operators to come up with the engine out assessment for that same missed approach ground track rather than the TERPS type assessment. We feel it'll be for their benefit.
It absolutely will be, I think, and this is where, you know, POI's understanding that they can get in intelligent conversations with the operator and ask them things like, are you going to use the area analysis method? Do you have or the flight track analysis method? Are you going to do any validation testing? I mean, the purpose of this IVT was hopefully to bring forward the intent of this advisory circular, and I'll tell you what, as far as the airline and the air carrier industry is concerned, it's all about the weight. Everything is about the weight. The more weight I can lift off and get into that runway, the more money I'm going to make. And our concern from the flight standards perspective is that's fine, but we want to make sure you do it with all the safety mitigations in place. And right now, that's what this advisory circular is serving both purposes. So thanks for that, Norm. That's a good observation. Well, I guess if no one else is going to call in, we're going to wrap this up. I certainly appreciate your attention. Like I said, we're going to have this on the FAA library in the next few days if you care to review it again. But like I said, if my mother told me I had to know all this stuff, I'd be sick about it. The other issue is we have bought a new gadget in AFS 400 that allows us to duplicate these DVDs by the thousands if we have to. And very shortly, as soon as we get it plugged in and operating, we're having a little issue with the thing actually working right now. We just got it out of the box, and of course it doesn't work. But we intend to get that fixed so we can be our own production company for these DVDs. And if you need more Cat 2 DVDs or RNP DVDs, which we haven't even done yet, by the way, we're going to get those out as soon as we can. We're going to have the capability right in AFS 400 to produce and mail those out to you very quickly. We've got dedicated people to run that machine. So with that in hand, I'd like to sign off now and thank everybody for coming by for this interactive video training and information sharing session. And I hope to see you again very soon with another one. So thank you very much, and we'll sign off now.